When people start to analyze their diet and their nutrition, inevitably they start to look at fats, carbs, and protein. And carbs are generally vilified, and fat is generally thought of as body fat, and protein is usually hailed as the super macronutrient. But the reality is we need all of them. We need fats, and we need proteins, and we need carbs, and we need them in a balance, in a way that helps us create metabolic health, in a way that helps us to grow and heal. It's really difficult to find balance. And right now, due to a couple of trends in diets and in fitness and publishing and things like that, a lot of people are really loading up on too much protein. And while that doesn't initially sound like a bad thing, and in fact in the short term it might not even be a bad thing, in months it might not be a bad thing, but over years, the effects of super elevated protein can actually be pretty detrimental. And if you're dealing with any kind of degenerative illness, it could be a really big problem. On this week's show, we'll talk about finding the Goldilocks zone for protein, meaning the zone that works best for you and your body, and hope clear up some of the confusion in and around animal versus plant-based proteins, correct levels based on your body weight and your training. I hope you find this useful. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, they're always most welcome. Email me podcast@yogabody.com. So hello and welcome. Welcome to the Lucas Rockwood Show. Today's show is called the Goldilocks Zone for Protein. And I am joined here with Stephen Cabral, naturopathic doctor. Stephen's a board certified naturopathic doctor. He has postdoctoral studies in Ayurveda and functional medicine. He and his team have completed more than 250,000 client appointments, which is kind of a shockingly huge number. He's a podcaster himself. Check out his podcast. It's called The Cabral Concept. And he's the author of a couple of books, The Rain Barrel Effect and A Man's Guide to Muscle and Strength. Both are available on Amazon, or even better, check out his website, stephencabral.com, and we'll link up in the show notes as well. Stephen, welcome to the show.
It's great being on. Thank you for having me.
This time of the year, people are trying to lose weight, and they're uber conscious of their diet and what's going in, and inevitably every year there's some sort of trend. And this year the diet du jour seems to be keto, and everybody's talking about keto, and they're getting these breath testers and these pee testers, and there's certainly nothing new. I mean, people have been measuring ketones since way back in Atkins times and things like that, but somehow it's reached critical mass. It's mainstream. So what's your take on the keto diet? Good, bad, just depends?
Yeah, I think as always, most things are always, it depends. But for the keto, it's very specific, meaning a keto-based diet is truly a medical type diet. I mean, we've used this and looked at it in the medical literature for cancer, to shrink cancer-based tumors, almost as a default because there's no glucose or really sugar coming in, which helps defeat cancer cells. We use it for type 2 diabetes and certain cardiovascular-based issues. But what happened was we took something that was more of a medical-based diet for not necessarily long-term use, extrapolated the data, kind of cherry-picked a few studies, and now we're using it for general population. And that's when it starts to get dangerous. So I'm not an advocate of long-term keto. I'm okay with it being a cyclical 2-3 weeks at a time maximum, but also knowing why you're doing it. That's always the most important. You don't just do a diet just to do it. You know the mechanisms behind it.
It's a really great point. I found the same as the other challenge that I have is of all the diets people think they're on, keto is the one that people think they're on, and almost nobody's actually in ketosis.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
I've almost never met anybody who's actually in ketosis. And so what ends up happening is people aim for keto and they end up just lowering their carbs, which, hey, that's great. Most people need to do that. They're overeating carbs, usually by about 2x or whatever. And so that's really great. But it's interesting in that almost everyone I meet who's convinced they're doing keto, they're still eating, 200 300 grams of carbs a day. And so they're nowhere near a ketogenic level. There's some of these breath testers and pee testers out there for people who are experimenting with a ketogenic diet. Again, with the caveat being, I completely agree with your recommendation. This is a therapeutic treatment. This isn't something that we don't have really much information about anybody doing this long term. The only one I've seen is Peter Attia, who I think did it for 3 years or something. And I've never really seen any other clinical data except with some epileptics. And even in those cases, I really doubt strict adherence for years. I'm not sure if you have other data, but for people thinking about keto sticks and breath things, do you find these tools useful? I think they just measure acetone. Is that right?
Yes. And I mean, Keto Mojo, I don't have any stake in the companies, but that's one that, we'll use. But the truth is that we just have no need for it. So the big thing is why are you doing it in the first place? If the goal is weight loss, there's much healthier ways to lose weight than lower your metabolism in the long term. And same for epilepsy. I mean, a lot of times with the epilepsy, we have an imbalance in the gut microbiome. So yes, you're starving it because you're not feeding any carbs, but eventually you're going to eat carbs again. That's just the way it is. So why not do it right from the beginning? And as you're alluding to, most people aren't in ketosis in the first place. One, because yes, they're having too many carbs, but the truth is that they're having too much protein as well, because protein can be converted to glucose as well. And that's through a process called gluconeogenesis. So it's important to look at what really ketosis or keto-based diet is. And it's not easy to follow. It's 70% fat, about 25% or so protein, 25 to 30, and 25 to 50 grams maximum carbohydrates, which really can just come from vegetables.
So for people listening, this is shockingly low carbs. Nobody does this on accident. This is very deliberate. You know if you're doing, nobody's accidentally in keto. In fact, everyone in keto is sort of quietly suffering, if not verbally suffering. And so it's one of these things that, again, you'll see all the popular books, a lot of CrossFitters and things claim to be into keto, and keto bars you'll see in the nutrition stores and things like that. But even a lot of these keto bars take you way out of keto because they have so many carbs in them. So it's a really, really great perspective. You touched on something that's really important that a bunch of people have been talking about in the research and medical and naturopath community, but the average health conscious person really hasn't paid attention to in the recent years, which is this idea that you can totally eat too much protein. And sort of, the pop health idea is that, yeah, too many carbs, everybody kind of understands that. Too much fat, they vilify fat for bad reasons, but whatever. And protein is kind of the macronutrient that everybody loves, right? We always think, we need more protein. Where's you getting your protein? Do you have a protein bar? Get a protein shake. And a lot of people don't realize that there's clinical data, a lot of research, anecdotal data, there's blood glucose levels, all these kinds of things that really negate the idea that you should just slam down protein. So part of the reason I titled this show The Goldilocks Zone for Protein is because a lot of people think the goal of protein is as much as possible every single day. It'll make me big and strong and lean. Can you kind of, unpack that challenge around that and what really happens when you bump up your protein into levels that some people attempting to do keto, or some people attempting to do a radical paleo, or some people attempting to do a really strict low carb thing can get into trouble with?
Without a doubt. And I went through this myself. So, a lot of times I always say the reason why I know these things is simply because I did most of the things wrong in my late teens and early 20s. I was sick for about 10 years of my life, from 17 years old to 27. And I tried everything under the sun to get well. And that allowed for a lot of experimentation. And this was essentially before the internet was coming out, and then right as it came out. So there was there wasn't this sharing of information. And I was doing a lot of natural bodybuilding. I was trying to do that because I had Addison's disease and rheumatoid arthritis and SIBO and candida overgrowth and type 2 diabetes. And I was just a mess. My immune system was all imbalanced. Well, I figured the one thing I could control was my body and the food that I put in it. So I was on a natural bodybuilding based routine, and I was eating a ton of protein. Well, the problem was I was getting unhealthier the more protein I was consuming. And there's a few reasons behind this. One is that it's the hardest thing to digest. Now, it's also one of the reasons why it keeps you more satiated. There's a thermogenic effect to it. But the other part is that your body needs a lot more water to flush your kidneys. It needs a lot more water in terms of moving all that protein through the bowels. And if you don't have good stomach acid, enzymes, all of these things, you're not going to be able to break down very well. So it's going to start to putrefy and ferment in your gut. So as I began to look at the research, what I realized was that health and body transformation don't always go hand in hand. And what most people need is the standard that's been around now for about 40 years, and that's 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And it simply means take your ideal body weight, cut it in half, a little bit less than that. That's it. So if you weigh 160 pounds, you need somewhere around 60 grams or so of protein per day. That can come from whatever sources you would like: vegan, animal-based, fish-based. But the problem is, the more animal-based sources of protein that you eat, the harder to break down, without a doubt, but also the greater increase in what's called IGF-1. We know that IGF-1 leads to cancerous tumor growth. Does that mean if you eat meat, you will get cancer? No, but the more meat you eat, the more likelihood you will grow cancerous tumors to a larger degree. So in my practice, I simply, preach the truth and health. And so what I like to do is just say, let's not go overboard with protein for overall health.
Okay, so a bunch of things we need to unpack there. So let's start with IGF-1. So this is insulin-like growth factor. This is a hormone that's really important for building muscle, right? But we get too much and then we have risk of cancer and tumor. Is that right? That's kind of my layman's understanding.
Without a doubt. And that what the studies found was that over 19% of your diet from any source of protein, but more so when it's meat-based, the IGF-1 levels go up, and that also correlates with cancer growth, tumor growth. And again, this was a very large study. I can give you the link if you'd like for the show notes later.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I've never really understood. So we have plant-based proteins, which are kind of deassembled amino acids, and then we have assembled amino acids for animal-based proteins, if I understand that correctly. But why is there a different response in terms of IGF-1? Why is there a greater link to cancer with animal proteins to vegetable proteins? Is that perhaps correlated with another factor that we're not looking at? Is that because maybe there's pesticide residues or something like that? Or does it actually have to do with the structure of the protein in animal foods versus plant-based foods, or do we not know?
Well, there's a lot to that. So there's a bunch of things going on. So with red meat alone, it's actually closer related to a carbohydrate than it is a protein, but it's called new 5GC. And they're finding that this is actually being linked to more cancer growth as well. So here's the thing, though. When you have one-offs and you say, well, a friend of mine or my uncle or my dad ate red meat, steak and eggs every day for breakfast, and he never got cancer. Well, yes, he never did. But that doesn't mean that 25% of the population won't. So what we like to look at is what's healthy over the general population. And then I also say, okay, here's state-of-the-art medicine, which I believe in functional medicine, state-of-the-art lab testing and research. But I also believe in the ancient wisdom of 6,000 years of Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine, Roman, Greek medicine. And what they knew was that meat and animal-based protein was an anabolic food, and it helped with growth of the body. So as we're younger and we're trying to build up the body, well, there's that part that can actually be beneficial. For more of the ectomorph or vata-based body type, as long as it's easy to digest, it can actually be somewhat beneficial because they have lower levels of IGF-1 in the first place. So, what I'm looking for is what can we look at over a person's life? And the older we get, 30s, late 30s to 40s and beyond, by consuming a lot of animal-based protein, we're not doing ourselves any service. Now, they did find this for all forms of protein. However, they found that the meat-based forms were more anabolic, causing greater levels of IGF-1 because there's also greater levels of hormone in meat in the first place rather than beans, chickpeas, etc.
You mentioned something that I know is going to light up some people's ears. You mentioned ectomorphs and vata. And so, different systems, we talk about things differently. So in Ayurvedic medicine, people listening, many of them are familiar with Pitta, Vata, and Kapha, and then in sort of bodybuilding circles, people talk about ectomorph and slow builders and slow gainers and things like this. Can you talk us through the similarities and differences? Because I know that you bridge those gaps between traditional and functional medicine and Ayurvedic medicine as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. It absolutely helped me bridge the gap in my own health, was understanding that my body is predominantly more of the Vata-based body type. But the other issue is that we live in a Vata-based society. And in the West, for example, everything is go, go, go. You're essentially, once you get up to the moment your head hits the pillow, you're doing something. You're on your computer, your phone, whatever it is. You're doing something. You're always on the go. So that's a Vata-based mindset in the first place. Well, those people, it makes it harder for them to gain weight, and they're more prone to anxiety and restlessness and fatigue, etc. But on the other side of the spectrum, we have the endomorph. Now, the endomorph does not mean overweight. A lot of people mean endomorph or kapha body type, that means overweight. It does not. It simply means the bone structure is actually larger, and you can obviously see this through x-rays and scans and the skeleton. But when you look at someone, you say, oh, that person has naturally larger calves. They have naturally larger forearms. Their head's more rounder rather than oval shaped. Like, it's very easy to see. But it goes very deep. Well, here's the thing. The endomorph, they look at carbohydrates and they basically gain weight. The ectomorph or vata, they look at carbs and they need that for their main fuel source because they're always in what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which means they're more prone to fight or flight. So if we were to bring it into like the yoga world, because yoga is actually one branch of the 8 branches of Ayurvedic medicine, is that the vata or the ectomorph would want to do more of the hatha-based yoga, more walking, more body weight-based exercise, where the endomorph, they are already anabolic. They don't need as much protein to keep mass on. That's why you see someone that doesn't really focus on protein and they say, oh, you don't really need that much protein. Well, yes, for you, because you're a kapha body type. You're an endomorph. And they actually need more vigorous training. So they'll be doing more of the ashtanga. They'll be doing more, instead of gentle flow-based poses, they're going to be moving through it vigorously. When I was over in India, and we had Surya Namaskara, what we would do is say, this person moves through it slowly, this person moves through it vigorously, everybody needs to do it.
So let's just, if we can link these up, this is again the first time I've talked through this, so I don't know if I'm getting these right, but ectomorph would be a vata, endomorph would be a kapha, and mesomorph would be a pitta. Is that, or is it not that linear?
No, you're exactly right, but then there's subtypes between that. So for example, my body type is closer to 55% or so vata, 35% kapha, and about 10-15% pitta. So there are variations within that, and then it changes per season. Then there's also your genotype, which is your actual body type. That's called your prakriti. And then there's your prakruti, which is your genotype. Your phenotype. That's what you become. So again, the kapha body type could become too emaciated and thin, and the vata could actually become overweight. So it gets complicated, but it is one of the most beautiful sciences if you want to learn it.
It's an interesting thing for people to understand, not to get put in a box, but just to understand how different we are. If you go to, I have yoga studios, you go to a yoga studio and you see the same group of people coming every day taking the exact same class. And one person gets bigger, the other person gets smaller. And it's really, people just respond totally differently to the same stimuli. We just have different wiring. And so I think understanding that is helpful for people to understand not just how they are, but how they might try to balance that out as well too. So if they're prone to getting too small, whether it's diet or movement to kind of find balance, or whether they're prone to getting too big, these kinds of things. It's an interesting insight that people can have.
I think it allows you to appreciate what you were given for a body. Be grateful for what you do have, because when you look at each, the endomorph, yeah, I mean, better immunity, they have a strong, robust nature. It's, so there's so many benefits to each one that we can respect what we have and not necessarily believe the grass is always greener on the other side.
I wanted to talk about blue zones, places where people live a long time, what we can learn from these. One of the biggest challenges that I find when you're looking at food research and health research is a lot of these studies are just looking at big swaths of people and kind of survey data and stuff like that. It's like, oh, maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. I live here in Spain, in Barcelona, and the most recent data I've seen is this is the second longest living people in the world. And average age is something like 80. And that was a total surprise to me. When I lived in the U.S., everyone talked about how the Mediterranean diet and lifestyle is amazing. I've lived here for 9 years. It's not amazing. People are basically drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, and drinking alcohol all the time, eating bread and stuff. It's not amazing, really. It's maybe there's a little bit less processed food around. It's just because it hasn't arrived yet. There's not like glorious, sort of fish and quinoa happening all the time. It's really, there's good oil, that's for sure. Meaning your average random oil is way higher quality than the PUFA oils and stuff in North America. But other than that, other than really high quality, totally fresh, hasn't been on a shelf for even 6 months, olive oil, which is ubiquitous and everywhere. I can't say there's anything better going on here. And so, I'm into this topic, so I explore it and I look and I watch what people are eating. And do people move more? Yeah, they walk more. The only thing I can really see is definitely there's huge differences in terms of lifestyle, in terms of levels of stress and things like that. So I get a little bit, I always kind of raise one eyebrow when I hear this data, but I'm curious. I know that you've explored this topic and you've thought about this. What kinds of things have you thought about and observed that maybe give you some conclusive things people could think about in terms of improving their health when they're modeling an area like here where people live for a long time?
For sure. And I actually believe that the Mediterranean diet isn't necessarily followed by Mediterranean people today. The studies and research we were looking for was based on previous generations, like our grandparents and beyond. So, even my grandparents ate different than we eat today, and they ate very different than my parents. They just ate closer to whole food, and they ate much less. So, when I've traveled to Europe many times, and what I can say that I don't necessarily believe it's better, but they're eating smaller breakfasts. That's an Ayurvedic thing. They're not eating the fruit and the cleansing based foods like in yogic and Ayurvedic. Their largest meals typically at breakfast, but not always. On the weekends, people go out, they stay out later, and a smaller meal or so at night, and they take a little time off in the afternoon. They allow for that sympathetic nervous system dominance, that fight or flight to go down. There's more relaxed. There aren't the same level of pressures, not for everyone, but again, these are generalizations. So part of that is the blue zones, because the blue zones isn't just about food, believe it or not. I believe there's 18 points, and I did a show on that as well. So like society and culture and community and having meals together, that's more a European thing for sure than a US-based thing. So, but when we're talking about diet, I mean, this is something that I've dedicated my life to because I have no allegiance to anybody and anything other than the truth, and I will change if I need to. But right now, Genetic testing right now, we look at the ApoE genotypes. The fat is between 15 and 35% depending on your genetic type. The protein is basically between 20 and 30%. The carbs are anywhere between essentially 45 and 65%. Now, that doesn't mean processed carbs. It means more vegetables if you're more of the coffee body type, and it means more of the sweet potatoes and root vegetables and starches if you're more of the vata and ectomorph type, right? But that's where it falls. And then I look at the research with cancer and I say, okay, like no matter how you slice it, there is a proven anti-cancer diet, and it is very close to the Mediterranean and Nordic diet. And it means the majority of your diet should be produce, fruit, vegetables, low glycemic fruit, berries, kiwi, grapefruit, things like that. And then predominantly vegetables, cooked, raw, whatever season you're in, that can matter. And then it's a fraction of your diet from protein. We look at the long-lived Okinawans and other Asian-based societies. Protein was a garnish to the meal. It was easy to digest soups and broths. So I think there's a lot we can take from that, because at no point has there ever been a study when you're trying to cure cancer that said, why don't we look at bacon and a high-fat diet and see if we can cure people not get cancer. That doesn't happen because we know it's the antioxidants and the phytonutrients in plants and vegetables, basically, it's just called produce, that helps to prevent all of the 4 major causes of death, which is cardiovascular, stroke, getting to be diabetes, and cancer. Well, we know that a high antioxidant diet, which squelches free radical damage, inflammation, et cetera, is going to help with that. So whether it should be fractionally different than a Mediterranean diet or not, if you shoot for that, you're going to be doing really well in life.
Let's jump back to your protein thing, because I know that some people still have some lingering questions. So you mentioned 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So let's say somebody should weigh 150 pounds. We cut that in half, 75 grams plus a bit. So let's just round it up to 85 or something like that. What happens if instead of eating 0.8 grams of protein per pound of ideal body weight per day, what if they eat too little? Let's just say half that. What happens if they eat double that? Is there a scenario where it might make sense to eat half that? Is there a scenario, bodybuilder or something like that, where it does make sense to eat double that, or is it not that easy?
Yeah, absolutely. And so 0.8 grams per kilogram is essentially always going to be a little less than half of your body weight. And then you can also go for your ideal body weight as well. So that 150 would be closer to like 65, 70. And then, so it's not as much as we believe. And also it can be over the course of a day. And then there's also debate of what time of the day. Well, in Ayurvedic times and when you look at all the lineage, and that goes for Mediterranean as well, lunch, now I have a little controversy around this because lunch is your strongest time of the day for digestion. However, unless you are in a society that takes a break for lunch, if you're eating at your desk and you're rushed and you're stressed, you should not be eating a ton of protein at that meal or a lot of food, because you're not in the parasympathetic nervous system. You cannot fully digest that meal. It's going to sit there. You're going to get bloated. It's going to start to ferment. You're going to cause a lot of digestive issues. But getting back to your question, because there's never one straightforward answer, is that for someone that's more of that anabolic type, that kapha body type, they can do a little bit less. And especially if they're not that active, because their body's already more anabolic. They have no trouble keeping muscle mass on their body. For the ectomorph, they're going to want a little bit more protein as long as it's digestible, easy to digest, that they chew up their food really well, that they have enough stomach acid, that maybe they have a little bit of ginger tea, hot ginger tea with a meal, or digestive enzymes. And then who would need more? Well, yes, anyone that's very physically active would need more as well, so that because when you go to the gym, you're working out, you're playing sports, you're breaking down muscle tissue. And you do need to repair that, and amino acids from protein is the easiest way to do it.
A couple of things you mentioned that I want to clarify for people. So the first thing is that of the macronutrients, fat, protein, and carbs, protein is the most satiating. And so what that means, it makes you the more full. That's why it's a lot more difficult for somebody to sit down and eat 2 pounds of steak than it is to eat, a giant French baguette, for example. It's the analogy that I always use. And so it's more satiating. But the other thing you mentioned is it's harder to digest, which is when people will often say that's a heavy meal. They'll often refer to, a meat-based meal or something with high protein as a heavy meal. And this idea of, your autonomic nervous system, your sympathetic branch and your parasympathetic branch, we're flipping back and forth throughout the day. And what the reference is, if you're in sympathetic mode, like a lot of us are all day long, answering emails, bouncing around, drinking coffee, you're not in a really strong digestive mode. And so if you take the protein, which is more challenging to digest when you're not in a really strong digestive mode. Most of your blood and your energy is going to your heart and your skeletal muscles and things like that, as opposed to your digestion. Then it's going to be more difficult to digest. I'm paraphrasing you there, but am I getting that more or less right?
Absolutely right. And if you look at it, fruit gets digested in about 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Grains, grains for the most part, and starches, about an hour and a half to 3 hours, depending on the protein. So eggs are easier to digest, fish a little bit easier to digest, some chicken, steak 2-3 hours. And that's if you have enough stomach acid to create that pH, that 2 to 3. But I mean, how many people in the world are on proton pump inhibitors, acid blockers, etc.? I mean, they really should not be eating those heavy meats at all.
Well, here's what happens. So people hear that, protein's harder to digest. They worry if they get too much, they're going to get insulin-like growth factor, increased risk of cancer or tumor growth or things like this. And they go, okay, I'm going to totally get rid of, I heard these guys, I'm going to totally get rid of meat. And, I personally haven't eaten meat in ages, but my kids eat meat. And I don't really recommend this for people because I find what happens is when people go down that path, they become breaditarians. And so immediately they just, with all the best intentions, suddenly their carb load goes up to 500 plus grams per day, and the metabolic disaster that results from that seems to be more detrimental. So how do people find a balance? Because when they start looking at plant-based proteins as well, there aren't a ton of options that don't come wrapped in a carb package. So for example, you go into the legume world and lots of really interesting proteins there, but comes with a lot of starch, and they're often triple starch. So it's, not just the beans, but the beans and the rice and the bread and the tortilla and the burrito. And very quickly, people are just kind of carb bombing themselves all day long. How do you help people find that balance?
Yeah, that's true. And also, I mean, how many people in the world right now, because of antibiotic use, birth control, alcohol, ibuprofen, et cetera, have candida overgrowth or bacterial overgrowth in their gut. So then they eat beans or they try to eat dal or chickpeas and they get so much bloating. Well, right, we need to fix the gut first, of course, before we can eat a lot more of those vegan-based proteins. But the truth is that the science does not say that you have to eliminate meat or fish completely. We want to, in my belief, and just from my practice, I mean, all of this is clinical data. We've done tens of thousands of lab tests all around the world. And so the majority of people do so much better with a little bit of fish in their diet. So they can have some sardines and mackerel and anchovies. Again, those are Mediterranean based. And then we have wild salmon and trout. So that's great. And then if you want to meat a little bit now and again, I support people in a vegan based lifestyle. I support people in any lifestyle. But if you're going vegan, you need to do your homework because you can become nutritional deficient, just like you said, because you become a carbivore and you are not balancing your amino acids. And you're just saying, well, there's protein in broccoli as well. Yes, there is, but you would need to eat, cartons of it in order to get the protein that you need for the day. So I just want people to be smart about it. Look for 10% to 15% of your diet or so for protein. And then to be honest, whatever source you choose, as long as it's clean, it's not going to cause a problem.
Really, really great information. I think this protein one is one that people just get so confused about. And I just see people just, slamming down protein shakes and trying to eat as many chicken breasts as they can. And with all the best intentions, I think sometimes people derail. I think the really hardest thing, at least it has been for me, is just always reminding yourself that what you're looking for is balance. And it's a balance between the macronutrients. It's a balance between stress and rest. It's a balance in your digestion. And it's a super boring topic. The idea of like starving yourself into ketosis is like exciting. And the idea of like, 5-day water fast is thrilling. And this, Ayurvedic medicine, of course, is all focused around balancing energies and things like that. And it's really hard to get excited about balance, but that's where all the juice is. That's where people find the most benefits. So, for people who would like to check out your books, follow your podcast for sure, where's the best place for us to send people to, Stephen?
So the main book on all the topics we were talking about today is called The Rain Barrel Effect. It basically tells people that if they're having trouble losing the weight, if they're having trouble getting well, which is, again, we talk about it might not be sexy, but the truth is that what is the goal that you have, right, of getting well, losing the weight, feeling alive again. So what we want to do is just realize that you're either suffering right now from some type of deficiency or some type of toxicity in your body. And there is a way to rebalance that. There's a way for everyone to rebalance that. There's an answer for everyone. So I talk about that in the Rain Barrel Effect. And then daily on my podcast, the Cabral Concept, I take each one of these topics just like we did today, talk for 25 minutes on that topic and just try to build off of that. So I appreciate you having me on and allowing me to speak with your community.
If you're a yoga teacher, a Pilates instructor, a group fitness instructor, a personal trainer, and you're looking to grow your business in 2019, I am hosting my popular 21-day private yoga business accelerator in January. This will be our 4th batch of students, and it's just been a huge success. A big part of the success is it's a very simple course. There's a bunch of courses online where you'll spend a year learning the ins and outs of online marketing and pay-per-click and all this crazy stuff that's just too much. It's just too much. It's good information, but it's just too much. Most people that I work with, that I train, that I speak to, they're looking to start working privately. They're looking to replace their income